Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Now, in this episode, we're taking a look at a topic that combines history, innovation, and the sweet, sweet irony of Russia's failed ambitions. All the above intersect in the blossoming of the Ukrainian defense industry. Kyiv's military-industrial complex is not just getting back on its feet, it's sprinting full speed into the future, fueled by drones, missiles, and a desperate need to kick Russia right back across its border.
Drones like these and thousands of others are the poster child of Ukraine's arms industry. They're manufactured domestically, and some are even made by civilians who want to help the soldiers fighting on the front lines. But over the last 3 years, Ukraine's arm production has grown beyond just its drones. Despite the ongoing war, Kyiv is eager to display its own military tech and attract foreign investors. Defense expos like these are also a chance to show the systems in action.
Ukraine has two key advantages. One, they are the low-cost producer of defense technology in the entire free world, and that's important to be able to compete with China globally.
The second advantage is that Ukraine is a unified ecosystem where new systems are being constantly tested on the battlefield. This presents a unique opportunity for investors, as there really isn't another active combat zone this large in the world. Germany, Turkey, and the United States are among those already interested. But what about Poland? Its arms manufacturers say they will work closely with the Ukrainian industry, but aren't making inroads as significant as the other players. Poland is constantly making headlines across the globe with how much it is investing into its own military, American-made planes, Korean-made tanks, and its own booming defense industry. As Warsaw seeks to position itself as a leader in NATO when it comes to arms production, experts emphasize that it must also build its presence within the Ukrainian defense industry, as Ukraine is the market of the future in this regard.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Alright, let's rewind a bit. Back in early 2022, when Russia initiated its full-scale invasion, Ukraine was primarily dependent on foreign arms to defend itself. Fast forward 2 years, and the narrative has changed quite a bit. Ukraine isn't just importing weapons anymore. Oh no, it's producing them. And we're not talking about just a few rifles and grenades here and there. Ukraine is now expanding its production of drones, electronic warfare systems, and missiles. It's like the country took a crash course in DIY military technology, and the final project was Defeat Russia 101. Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal even rolled out a preferential loan program for arms manufacturers. So if you're in Ukraine and have a dream of building the next big drone, guess what? Well, the government is here with low-interest loans and a can-do spirit. But Ukraine's expertise in the defense industry didn't just pop up overnight. This isn't some military startup that came out of nowhere. No, historically, Ukraine was a key cog in the Soviet war machine. In those times, a fifth of the USSR's military-industrial complex was based in Ukraine, employing a whopping 3 million people. Now, the irony is quite thick here. Putin wanted to drag Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence, but instead his invasion has inadvertently revived Ukraine's Soviet-era role as a defense production powerhouse. Except this time, instead of building weapons for Moscow, they're making them to blow Russian equipment to smithereens. If Putin was hoping for a return to a golden Soviet era, congratulations! It's just not the one he envisioned. And if that's not enough, Western manufacturers have found a testing ground in Ukraine. You see, a live war zone is like an extreme sport for defense companies. Western companies are lining up like it's Black Friday at a military tech store. They're sending drones, missiles, and all kinds of experimental tech for Ukraine to test in the most real-world scenario imaginable. This battlefield experimentation has made Ukraine a hotbed for military innovation. Think of it as a Silicon Valley for weapons, only instead of developing the next big app, they're figuring out the best way to take out a Russian tank. In the ultimate twist of fate, Russia's invasion has galvanized Ukraine. It is now a key player in the defense industry, innovating at breakneck speed, and all thanks to the invasion that was supposed to bring it to its knees. So, in a way, Putin has achieved his goal of reviving a golden Soviet era. It's just that the glory belongs to Ukraine. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Mark McName, co-founder of Ukraine Business News Network. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we are discussing the Ukrainian military-industrial complex today. And, well, when we talk about the Ukrainians using weapons, most of the time we think about these shiny Western-supported arms. However, we do also know that Ukraine does have a very robust military-industrial complex ever since the invasion. Can you shed a little bit light of just how robust it actually is?
Sure. Robust insofar as you have to think of the development of what has happened, and you have to think about the decimation of the previous defense industry here. So Ukraine, maybe viewers aren't very familiar. Within the Soviet Union, Ukraine was actually really the stronghold, sort of the heartland of a lot of the domestic production, missile production, tanks, the Kharkiv tank factory in particular. And then, of course, these things fell apart in the 90s, 2000s. And then with the war, a lot of these industries and a lot of the resource base for the defense sector were destroyed after the full-scale invasion 2022. And then really in the last 2 years and each month, you just see these rapid advances. And not just in sort of basic areas like ammunition or artillery, some of these more traditional areas of defense, but in some of the most cutting-edge areas like electronic warfare, lasers, drones, of course, broadly speaking, marine drones as well, robots going to the front, evacuating soldiers. So it's really across the entire board. And actually the problem has become, which I'm sure we'll talk about, the issue of exporting out of Ukraine, some of these defense technologies. But the problem has actually become that the funding from the Ukrainian government towards the defense sector is topped out, and so you have so much capacity that's really unused, and the federal orders coming from Kyiv are not enough, and so they need to be sort of tapping into financing outside the country and linking more with defense sectors outside of Ukraine.
Right. So like you mentioned, we're not looking at just Soviet era weapons any longer, but also the transition to more modernity with cutting edge technology. Do you think that would also help Ukraine perhaps integrating with some of its NATO allies?
Absolutely. And the point here is that it's a two-way street. Ukraine, of course, wants the industrial base, but also the latest advancements in the research prowess of the West to, of course, incorporate into their existing pipeline here in Ukraine, but then vice versa. There's so much cutting-edge stuff going on here that Western governments, right, but then Western private defense companies, they want to be here on the ground as well. So, I mean, there's numerous stories of, just off the top of my head, a couple of Western European defense drone manufacturers and electronic warfare companies that have a decades-long history of working on some of these projects, moving here, right? Moving production here so that they could be, because things are developing so rapidly on the front, they want to know exactly what are Ukrainians developing, and then they can incorporate this back into their systems in the West. And then critically, the enemy, what Russia is, either maybe developing or in response to Ukraine's developments, then reacting with. And so they get to see everything here, right? The most cutting edge developments in these areas, and then of course implementing those things back into Western systems, which is absolutely critical when we think long term for Ukraine and its defense industry. These deeply integrated relationships that have developed so rapidly over the last nearly 3 years, which again really reorients Ukraine. Politically, of course, but even in the defense industrial base, with the Western world, with NATO systems, NATO standards, and again, away from the old Soviet standards. So we're watching every day this sort of removal of the Soviet heritage defense industrial complex and movement into a Western industrial complex. And so really lodging itself, deeply embedding itself within the Western defense world.
Right. So perhaps the practicality is something that drives the innovation that we're looking at right now. Previously, you also mentioned some of the funding issues when it comes to the government perhaps already topping off when it comes to the funding and to the military industrial complex and Ukraine needing foreign funding at this point. Can you help us understand that a little bit more?
Sure. So, I'll start sort of legislatively with what has been discussed the last couple of months, and it looks like will be a lifting on an export ban. Right. And now a lot of this is related to drones, but not exclusively to drones. Lifting on an export ban, which seems, of course, to an outside observer as counterintuitive. This is the country at war in Ukraine. They're not only importing Western arms, but developing their own arms industry here. And of course, they have an existential crisis and they have urgency to be providing those arms to the front. The issue here, though, is that what they've developed is so actually profitable, and the funding here is so sort of lacking within Ukraine itself that it actually makes more sense for them to develop some products here, export them abroad, and gain the solid revenue and profits from that to then reinvest here domestically. Because one of the biggest problems here is that even if a company is successful in winning a defense tender in Ukraine, typically the biggest complaint is that it's just inadequate for all the costs involved. They cover their basic manufacturing costs typically, but that's it. And then there's nothing left over for all the other costs, and most in particularly research and development, which is of course is critical to staying on the cutting edge as staying a step ahead of Russia in this very rapidly transformative war. We're seeing defense technologies and innovation just taking off so quickly. So this is the critical aspect is then, again, and it would be so critical long term, because then you develop these linkages between Western financiers coming here, Western defense companies, not to mention at the governmental level too, state defense industries, linking up with Ukrainian partners. And that means production domestically within Ukraine, but then also some relationships even outside of Ukraine, taking Ukrainian engineers and know-how and replicating that in the West.
Right. So can you help us understand how that works as well? You just mentioned Ukraine actually have to export some of this weapon for the revenue to reinvest back into the Ukrainian military industrial complex, which already are producing some of these cutting edge technology and weapons. However, a lot of the foreign aid going into Ukraine actually do come in the form of weapon, and especially when it comes to U.S. support for Ukraine in the form of arms, a lot of discussion is on kind of using these kind of more retired or phase out U.S. weaponry and sending them to Ukraine. How does that work with one another? Do they come in a form where they can alleviate some of Ukrainian need to produce some of these different type of weapons, or just basically how does it work?
Sure. So I think the confusing aspect, we're talking about different categories, right? So for example, Ukraine produces its own ammunition, artillery, howitzers, things like this, but then the West is providing the majority of that to Ukraine. But then you get into areas like drones, where most of that is actually being domestically produced, often using Western parts or Chinese parts, in fact, but it is primarily being domestically produced. So I guess the point is that there's no it depends upon the category. It's not so basically what Ukraine can do in, say, drones areas, electronic warfare areas, laser technology, would be to export some of that to the West in order to gain greater funding, so then they can refinance sort of domestic manufacturing production. But in areas, for example, like ammunition for machine guns or what have you, those areas are not necessarily ripe for Ukrainians to be exporting abroad. Wouldn't be an area like that, or armored vehicles or things like that. And then exactly the opposite, air defense. Ukraine is almost entirely importing, so there's no opportunity there, and there's no real major domestic development of air defense that would be worth exporting abroad. So it just depends upon the categories, right? And the most novel, innovative stuff, it's by and large in the drones area.
Right. So yeah, like I mentioned, there's perhaps different categories and which it functions. Now, when it comes to the Ukrainian military and aid coming from the West, in light of recent election results, there's been talks about possibly changing, perhaps the format in which Ukraine's being supported by allies like the United States. Do you see the whole structure undergoing another shift?
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily another shift. I would say it's just going to reinforce the fact that Ukraine, in the future, look, inevitably Ukraine is going to be on its own at some point. It's just a matter of when. And I'm not saying that in a fatalistic way or citing some unfortunate news.
Right.
It's just the reality that it's an independent nation state in the same way Israel developed its own domestic manufacturing. It has to look out for its own national security interests. Ideally, it gets embedded in NATO in the future so we can sort of bridge to that point where until Ukraine is more self-sufficient. But look, we have concerns currently about, we're less than 3 years into the war, the full-scale war, about defense support and political will from the West. Where are we in 2 years, 8 years, 25 years? I mean, as you know, as we all know, Russia's not going to magically disappear. The state of Moscow has invaded Ukraine, modern-day Ukrainian territory over 30 times over the last 300 years. So every Ukrainian knows that it's just a matter of time and they need to defend themselves going forward, in the same way that Israel feels like it's a national security state and has to constantly defend itself permanently. So Ukrainians feel the same way. So I guess the point is, whether Trump is president or Harris had won the election or somebody else, or in 4 years we have somebody new, Ukrainians understand that they are, over time, going to be on their own. It's a matter of when and how fast. And so to that end, that's why they're making a lot of these decisions. And I think critically, the government has to, the Zelensky government has to appeal to the current president, to the incoming president, Donald Trump, appeal to his interests, which this is where you get into a transactional president, get into these areas like Ukraine has phenomenal resource base, is developing its own domestic defense lines. You can link this with the West and basically with a transactional president and Trump appeal to his economic business interests. And so this is one of those potential areas where in terms of the political rhetoric, where Zelensky can maybe appeal to Trump to get him on board for this.
Great. Thank you so much for your input and insight. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Great. My pleasure.
Cheers. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Now, in war, the cost often falls back on the aggressor. For Russia, the toll of this invasion has now surpassed 77,000 casualties, according to the independent Russian media outlet Mediazona. Some analysts believe the real number may be even higher.
Reap what you sow. That is the lesson that is being brutally exacted upon Russian invaders by Ukrainian defenders. The names of more than 77,000 soldiers who have died in a war of Moscow's own making serve as this lesson's textbook. And it is a lesson that seems to fall on deaf ears among Russia's leadership, which refuses to end the conflict. October 2024 is proof of that. The British Defence Secretary says that the past month was the worst one in terms of casualties for Russia since the war's beginning. Russia's total losses in the war are estimated at around 700,000.
Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine appears to be approaching a new, darker phase. Vladimir Putin has just signed a landmark defense agreement with North Korea. This comes amid reports of North Korean troops actively supporting Russian forces in the Kursk region.
These are simple words put to paper with a pen, yet they will change much for so many. By ratifying the defense deal with North Korea, the Russian Senate has approved a deal Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un have been waiting for months. This deal brings Pyongyang and Moscow the closest they have been since the Cold War, though its exact details remain a mystery. As the deal has been finalized, American media warn that Russia is set to launch a 50,000-strong offensive to push the Ukrainians out of the Kursk region. North Korean troops are reportedly to be part of this operation, unofficially bringing their country into this war.
Elsewhere, another Russian ally faces challenges. Iranian officials have urged newly elected U.S. President Donald Trump to reconsider his maximum pressure policy towards Iran, which he had previously adopted.
If there's one country in the world which is not too happy at seeing Donald Trump elected, it's Iran. During his first term, the controversial American president had adopted a strongman policy towards Iran and its economy. Now, experts and insiders alike are saying that his new administration will tighten the sanction noose around Tehran. Iran itself is scrambling. Its foreign minister has denied that the country had planned a plot to kill Trump. Such a claim was unveiled by the US Department of Justice very recently, as it charged an Afghan national claiming he was tasked by an Iranian Revolutionary Guard official with killing the president-elect. One of the biggest blows Trump had dealt to Iran was the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani in January 2020. Iran's leaders had vowed revenge for this strike.
Russia's efforts to expand its alliances stretch beyond Europe and the Middle East. Recently, Vladimir Putin has reached out to African nations like Burkina Faso, offering them what he calls total support.
Moscow is continuing its search for a new network of partners in the wake of Western sanctions. Asia and the Middle East, and now Africa. The weekend summit in Sochi was a big step forward in attracting African nations to Russia, though Putin himself did not attend. Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso have moved away from relations with former colonial power France following a series of military coups since 2020. All three countries have pivoted towards Moscow. Burkina Faso in particular has said that a partnership with Russia suits the country more than its former ties with France had. Russia's involvement in the series of military coups remains a subject of debate.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.